Picture a maximum security prison. Fortified walls, armed guards, layers of steel, razor wire. Totally impenetrable, right? Well, what if the ultimate escape route wasn't digging a tunnel in the dirt or scaling a massive concrete wall? Okay, let's dive into this explainer. Today, we're looking at the absolutely breathtaking true story of Pascal Payet. This is a man who literally refused to be caged, pulling off some of the most audacious prison breakouts in modern history. So, you might be wondering, how exactly does a maximum security prisoner just escape? By looking up. You see, when we think of prison breaks, our minds usually go to slow, agonizingly careful tunneling or maybe some elaborate disguise. But Payet? He realized that modern French prisons back in the early 2000s were incredibly fortified horizontally, sure, but they were completely vulnerable vertically. His method of choice? Helicopters. But to really understand how a guy orchestrates aerial jailbreaks, we first need to look at who he was before he became France's most wanted.
Section 1. The Making of a Criminal, a Code of Honor Among Thieves.
Now, what's really interesting here is who Payet actually was before the helicopters. Born in Lyon in 1963, he started out as a teenager stealing cars, eventually climbing the ranks of the French underworld. But he definitely didn't see himself as just some common street thug. He built this incredibly tight-knit crew. You had Payet, the seasoned pro, working alongside Eric Albareo. Eric was his fiercely loyal protector who actually served 10 years for nearly beating a man to death just to protect his girlfriend. And later, they brought in Michel Valero, who they recruited while on the inside. Together, they pulled off high-level armed robberies, but they had this absolute unbreakable rule: no bloodshed. If a job went sideways, the plan was always to drop the loot and walk away with clean hands. But tragically, in 1997, that rule was broken.
Section 2. The Botched Bank Heist, November 20, 1997.
Okay, so the crew was feeling desperate after a legitimate tire business they tried to run totally failed. So they decided to hijack an armored truck outside the Bank of France in Salon-de-Provence. It was a stormy, super chaotic day. The bad weather forced the guards to rush toward the bank, which completely threw off the gang's carefully laid plans. And the timeline of what happened next took merely seconds. Payet cornered the guards with an AK-47. Suddenly, one of the guards, who was carrying 2 heavy bags of cash, dropped a bag, drew his weapon, and fired. He hit Payet squarely in the chest. As Payet fell backward, his finger clenched on the trigger of his heavy weapon. His reflex fire sprayed the area, hitting his own accomplices, Eric and Michel, and tragically striking the guard. Within just 1 minute, the entire crew was fleeing the scene, completely empty-handed and bleeding out. We really have to ground the story respectfully right here, because the victim of that chaotic shootout was 48-year-old Richard Cassel. He was simply a security guard, doing his job, and he left behind a grieving wife and 2 children. For Payet, claiming it was just an involuntary reflex didn't change the devastating reality. He was now a cop killer. What followed was basically a cinematic, desperate flight for survival. With Payet's lung punctured and bleeding heavily, the gang desperately reached out to the underworld. They managed to find an illicit nurse to arrange an emergency blood transfusion. And then they tracked down a corrupt surgeon in Lyon who performed a life-saving underground operation in a hospital while hiding all their identities. Once he was stable enough, the trio slipped right across the border to Switzerland, completely vanishing from a massive French police manhunt.
Section 3. The First Helicopter Breakout, October 12, 2001.
Let's fast forward a bit. After 2 years on the run, Payet was finally captured in Paris in 1999. By October 2001, he's sitting in Lyon's prison awaiting this massive trial for the murder of the guard. But Payet, he had absolutely no intention of facing the judge. Instead, he orchestrates his very first jaw-dropping aerial stunt. Now, how do you get a helicopter near a prison without raising massive alarms? You send a fake fax. Yeah, seriously. An accomplice forged a fax that looked like it came from the local mayor's office, warning the prison administration that a helicopter would be flying low the next day to crop dust for insects. And the prison staff completely bought it. They even warned the guards in the towers not to panic when the chopper showed up. So the crucial point is this. Under French law at the time, prison guards were strictly forbidden from firing their weapons unless their own lives were directly threatened. So when this hijacked helicopter just hovered over the prison yard right at 4 p.m. during recreation time, the guards literally could only watch in stunned silence. A bag containing bolt cutters was dropped right down to Payet. He snipped the perimeter fence, sprinted 50 meters to the waiting chopper, and just vanished into the sky. The whole thing took under 4 minutes.
Section 4. Returning for the Crew, Unprecedented Loyalty.
So, Payet was free, disappearing back into the criminal underground.
But remember that strict code of honor we talked about earlier? It was about to trigger one of the most insane risks ever taken by a fugitive. While Payet was out, his closest friends Eric and Michelle were left behind. In December 2002, they stood trial for the bank heist and were handed crushing 20-year prison sentences. And guess where they were sent? Right back to Luynes prison, the exact same facility Payet had just escaped from. Now, Payet was literally the most wanted man in France. He had every reason in the world to stay completely off the grid. But according to the underworld, he had made a promise before he escaped. He promised he would come back for them. And Payet was the kind of man who lived and died by his word to his brothers. In April 2003, merely 5 months after their sentencing, the familiar sound of rotor blades echoed over Luynes prison yet again. But this time, the prison had installed these heavy metal anti-helicopter nets all over the recreation yards. Well, Payet came prepared. Hovering over the nets, an accomplice dropped down with a heavy-duty power saw, sliced a hole right through the metal, and lowered a rope ladder. In just 5 minutes, Payet extracted Eric, Michelle, and another mafia boss named Frank Perletto. It was a complete humiliation for the French penal system.
Yet, criminal masterminds aren't perfect. Let's look at this bizarre contrast. On one hand, you have this highly tactical, flawless 5-minute helicopter rescue. But a few weeks later, they get arrested while fast asleep in a quiet rural country inn. They had actually tried to rob a massive gold shipment in Switzerland, failed, and authorities tracked them straight back to their cozy hideout. Over 50 heavily armed officers raided the inn at dawn, catching them completely off guard, surrounded by this massive cache of military-grade weapons.
Section 5. The Bastille Day Escape, July 14, 2007. Captured once again, the justice system was absolutely determined to make an example of the king of escapes. In 2005, Payet was finally sentenced to 30 years in prison for the murder of the security guard. To make sure he could never fly away again, the prison administration threw him into extreme isolation. They constantly moved him from prison to prison, never letting him settle down. He was kept in solitary confinement 24/7, subjected to these degrading daily strip searches. It broke him down so much that he actually went on a grueling 51-day hunger strike just to protest the inhumane conditions. Eventually, the administration slowed down his transfers, placing him in Gros prison in 2007. And that slight hesitation, that was all the opening he needed. And this brilliantly illustrates Payet's tactical mind. He chose July 14, 2007 for his ultimate escape. Why? Because it was Bastille Day, the French national holiday. He knew there would be a skeleton crew on duty, he knew the fireworks would perfectly mask the noise of the rotors, and he perfectly timed it for the 6:30 p.m. guard shift change when literally everyone was distracted. His accomplices hijacked a tourist helicopter from a nearby airfield and flew it way below the radar, practically invisible to the authorities. They landed that helicopter directly on the roof of the solitary confinement ward. 3 masked, heavily armed men leaped out. They used a gas-powered heavy saw to cut straight through the heavy steel doors and internal metal bars of the prison roof. Because they were holding a gun to the hijacked pilot's head, the guards, once again, couldn't legally shoot. Within 10 minutes, they reached Payet's cell, extracted him, and vanished right into the holiday sky. It was his third and arguably most spectacular aerial escape.
Section 6. The final capture. The fall of the king.
But this is where the story shifts. The great master planner was ultimately undone by just amateurish mistakes. You see, Payet's old, highly disciplined crew was locked up. He had to rely on enthusiastic but super clumsy amateurs who were doing it for the glory of beating the system, not for the money. In fact, during the hijacking of a multi-million-euro helicopter, one of his new accomplices actually stopped to steal a petty 150 euros from the airfield's cash register. Just absurd, sloppy behavior. They boasted in bars, left DNA everywhere, and basically led the police right to their doorstep. Just 2 months later, in September 2007, Spanish police, coordinating closely with French authorities, tracked these amateurs to a crowded coastal bar near Barcelona. An elite task force of 25 heavily armed officers just swarmed the bar. Payet reached for his hidden gun, but he was completely overwhelmed. And just like that, the king of escapes was taken down in this incredibly anticlimactic struggle over a few drinks. The aftermath was pretty grim. Payet received an extra 5 years for that final escape. His fiercely loyal original crew met really tragic ends. Eric Albareo was murdered after his release in 2013, and Alain, one of the amateur accomplices, was assassinated in 2016.
But Payet's legacy? That was cemented forever. He officially became the undisputed godfather of chopper escapes, inspiring a whole new wave of aerial breakouts across France.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating final question. After spending years being shuffled secretly between prisons, Pascal Payet was actually quietly paroled in 2019, having served less than half of his total cumulative sentences. He's now an older man, living out his days under strict, constant surveillance. But for a guy who looked at an impenetrable fortress and simply decided to fly away, not once, but 3 times, we really have to ask, is the King of Escapes truly grounded forever? Let that sink in. Thanks so much for joining this explainer, and we'll see you next time.